So, okay. So, hello and welcome everyone to episode 7 of the Digging In series. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series. Digging In is a series of live presentations with scholars from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are going to begin with a land acknowledgement for the land that the Peabody Institute and its school, Phillips Academy, are on. Phillips Academy occupies the land of the Pennacook and Pawtucket people and the lands of the contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. We honor all Indigenous people who are here now and have been here for time immemorial and will be here in the future. We acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities. We understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. We commit to interrogating the histories of and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy and beyond. So join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through December for our presentations. And for a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society Facebook page. And if you enjoy our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you outstanding programming through the support of viewers like you. And today we are very excited to welcome Dr. Lynn Harris. Dr. Harris has worked as a maritime historian and underwater archaeologist for over 30 years in South Africa, Namibia, Costa Rica, North and South Carolina. Areas of specialization include the maritime history of the southeastern US seaboard, maritime material culture, and coastal cultural resource management. She worked for the Maritime Archaeological Research Division of University of South Carolina for 13 years and conducted extensive underwater archaeology fieldwork in local rivers and marshes. Currently, since 2008, Harris is a professor at the Program of Maritime Studies in the History Department at East Carolina University. And she teaches courses in shipwreck archaeology, maritime heritage of the North Carolina Outer Banks, watercraft history, and African and Caribbean maritime history and archaeology, leading field schools in those areas. She is also an author of the book Patroons and Paraguas, Enslaved Watermen of the South Carolina Low Country, and editor of a Springer compiled volume, Seaports and Sea Power, African Maritime Landscapes. Journal articles, amongst others, include African Canoe to the Plantation Crew, Tracing African Memory and Legacy in Coriolis and Interdisciplinary Journal of Maritime Studies from 2014, and that won the annual Journal Writers Award. Harris has several awards for fieldwork photography and Diversity Field School Award for Costa Rica from the Society for Historical Archaeology from 2014 to 2017. And in 2019, she served as a consultant for National Geographic documentary, Drain the Oceans, on slave ship history and underwater archaeology. So pretty cool to get that in right before COVID hit and everything. And during the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will give our speaker time to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding we might not get to all of them. So welcome, Dr. Harris, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you very much, Lindsay, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually today to share my research, and I'll try my best to fit it all into our time slot. All right, let me try and navigate the share screen feature. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yep, it looks great.
Good. Okay. All right. Now to move it to the next slide. Has it moved to the next slide, Lindsay?
No, it hasn't. You should just be able to do it with your mouse, just clicking. Like you would a normal.
Ah, there we go. I got it. All right. Okay. So as Lindsay mentioned, I first started this research in the 1990s. I was employed, very fortunately, as an underwater archaeologist with the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. And my job was to manage the field office in Charleston along the coast. And our jobs involved recording sites in state waters. That was the rivers, the estuaries, the ocean along the coastline. And we also responded to reports by the public who found shipwrecks and bits and pieces of boats, and then followed up with assessing and monitoring these sites to add to the state inventory. The other very important goal was to establish a historical context and significance. And we knew that the communities along this maritime landscape were very multicultural, but at the same time, they were not homogeneous Native American, African, or European groups. They came from different ethnic groups, and they brought with them their respective maritime cultures, which probably merged through time and defined this, this maritime landscape or waterscape, as you will. So ultimately, I wrote my dissertation on this topic and published a book. And this is not a plug for my book by any means. There's been a much more recent research out on this topic. All right, so to define the title of this book, Patroons and Periagas. They're scattered throughout the colonial literature when you do research on these areas. And patroon is a term for a captain of any ethnicity of a plantation boat, whereas periagas are sailing or rowing boats used for coastal and river trade, but most often built and crewed by enslaved Africans and often enslaved Native Americans as well. And most scholars believe boats within the context of plantations were also symbols of freedom, resistance, and rebellion. They are portrayed in a lot of the low country artworks. For example, Jonathan Green is an African-American painter, and he's known for these very vibrant depictions of Gullah culture, and you can see some of his artwork in the slide. Periaga is spelt in many different ways, as was fairly typical in the colonial literature. So you'll see it spelt Periaga, Perioga, Periaga. In Spanish, Portuguese, and French, versions of these words all exist, and they mostly translate to dugout canoe. So given the multicultural heritage of Charleston, the French Huguenots, the Angolan Congo slaves who often spoke Portuguese, and early Spanish explorers, it's not surprising that this terminology became fairly commonly used to denote a boat form. So a periaga is such an iconic boat that North Carolina's Maritime Museum, boat building center, actually built a replica about 15 years ago. It was constructed based on historical descriptions and archaeological information as part of a partnership between the Paquimans County Restoration Society and our own East Carolina University's Maritime Studies program. But one of the defining features of these boats was that they were built with one giant log as a canoe base, or two types of canoes joined together along the center line. And this particular model featured in the film Harriet, which came out in 2019. It's based on a very thrilling and inspirational life of an iconic American freedom fighter, and it tells the story of Harriet Tubman's dangerous missions to liberate enslaved Africans. So when I began this research, most scholars attributed the dugout boat form and canoes in the archaeological record to Native American, or at least a Native American tradition that was passed on. And while this is very likely, other groups like Africans who built and crewed riverine and coastal boats, I felt should feature more prominently in the narrative. So essentially my research argument or statement was that historical, archaeological, and ethnographic sources suggest that an African maritime legacy persisted in large slaveholding colonies like South Carolina, and that we need to look more closely at maritime traditions such as coastal warfare, boat building practices, aquatic endeavors, including swimming, hunting, hunting alligators, for example, and then comparing and tracing regional maritime legacies within the African diaspora that may define neglected contributions to the New World. So I really dug into the research sources, fitting with our Diggin In series today. Not only archaeology sources, but also plantation journals, correspondence, probate records, often the planters left wills where they willed to their descendants a plantation boat. They left the name of the boat, what it was worth, the names of their enslaved crew members. And so we get a little bit of insights about the boatmen themselves. Shipwright correspondence, colonial records, newspaper advertisements and notices, material culture, photographic records, archaeological records, and then ethnohistorical and ethnographic records. Some of the challenges and biases in this research was, of course, hearing the voices of the patroons. Most of them are European colonial records. I really looked hard for the role of women on boats. Most of the time they were depicted, especially in the imagery, simply as passengers. There were also challenges such as the integrity and preservation of boats in the archaeological record. Many of them were underwater in fairly turbulent environments, or disintegrated or disarticulated. And then also looking for comparative data sets in the colonies, the Caribbean islands, and Africa. And it was always quite a challenge trying to distinguish between Native American, African, and European prototypes or construction trays that would suggest a Creole product. So I'll start with the archaeological record. For shipwrecks on riverbanks or riverbeds, as you can see, we really didn't have much visibility. It was kind of like diving in a glass of iced tea. You could see what you were doing, but it definitely wasn't the clear waters of some of the Caribbean islands. And so we would tag the timbers with numbers to orientate ourselves and the divers, take close-up photographs, and then draw and measure the shipwrecks or the boats that we found. We also recruited recreational divers in the local communities who would come up and help us and train them to assist in these projects. And ultimately, one of our initiatives was to create an underwater trail with guidelines, and this would help to orient the divers and then have slates which would tell them about the features on the boats and a little bit about the history of the sites. We also kept an inventory of the artifacts found on these riverbeds, often in proximity to these boats. And many of them were reported by the divers who were involved in the project. And one of the most interesting were these shards of what we call colonna ware, which is a Creole low-fired, locally made coarse earthenware pottery that enslaved Africans produced. Now, it was formerly mistaken with that of Native Americans, particularly if you didn't have the whole vessel. And on the basis of these colonna ware bowls, you could see this cross, thought to be a maker's mark. But as researchers looked into the signage and started to research some of the African potteries, they now believe that African priests performed certain ritual traditions passed on from the Bakongo Africans in the Congo-Angola area to South Carolina. So this is the basic cosmogram, a simple cross or line with a line through it, representing the boundary between the physical and the spiritual world. Some of the sites were not underwater, but they were buried in marshes. This one's named the Malcolm Boat, after the person who found it, not knowing the name of the vessel itself. And it's likely from its construction to be a coastal trading vessel, more in the style of European plank and frame construction. And it was likely designed for strength and to carry a very heavy load of cargo. It had a lengthy life, and it was stripped of its hardware and abandoned in this riverbank. And we call these types of sites, now you see them, now you don't. We had to design our work field project around the tides. So we would work when the tide was low and then go home, come back the next day to be completely covered up and submerged, and we'd have to dig it out again. So incredibly physically strenuous work. So based on the archaeological record, the recording team constructed a hull shape showing the mast location. Representation shows a very, what we believe to be functional and aesthetically pleasing vessel. Several other small vessels like these were recorded, and we surmise that they were likely plantation built. Some of the interesting features that contrast to a shipyard built vessel by European trained shipwrights were that timbers were not debarked, they were fairly unfinished. And they also used unfinished tree limbs as some of the framing members or the ribs. In Savannah, Georgia, we work with colleagues, some of you might know them, Fred and Emma Harker, on an even larger example of a sailing vessel that dated from the hardware to 1780 to 1820, approximate range. And this particular example was stripped and buried to stabilize a rice bank. The shape of the hull suggests a very fast offshore sailing vessel, probably for the West Indies trade. But interestingly, it had a periaga hull shape in its design, but built in a European tradition. So we think that it is a kind of a mix of a bottom-based construction design with framing, so it's a creole project, if it were. So the Clydesdale vessel, which is the previous one, was stabilized and left in place, as many of them are. But a similarly designed vessel called the Brown's Ferry vessel, it wasn't actually a ferry vessel, it was found at a ferry landing, is a shipwrecked colonial vessel excavated in 1976 by the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. They also had one of the first East Carolina University field schools on the site. And based on the analysis of artifacts, it sank sometime between 1730 and 1740 in the Black River. But at the time of its discovery, the wrecked vessel was judged to provide a very unique view into the shipbuilding industry of southern British colonies in North America. It looks huge in this photograph, but it was around 50 feet with a beam of 14 feet. It was built of local timbers like oak, pine, and cypress with a very flat bottom and no keel, suggesting it was used for river work. And when it sank, its cargo, principal cargo was a load of bricks. So this is one of the earliest riverine projects in North America. Other examples of riverboats include museum exhibits, like the Bessie, is the name given to the boat, in the Charleston Museum courtyard. And these are the last remaining 19th century plantation boats. Curatorial records indicate that it was owned by the Manigault family on the Santee River. This was sort of an ethnic enclave of French families who lived on this river, which was frequently the case with people who networked with other colonists. It's really a giant canoe. This is made out of a single log with a built-up freeboard, and it is 30 feet long, about 5 feet wide. It has what we describe as in nautical terms, a plumb bow and a wine glass shaped stern. It has a number of frames and half frames inside this giant canoe shell, and then a centerboard trunk added later with 2 areas for masts that could be unstepped fairly easily. So it was probably used for a combination of offshore as well as riverine and coastal sailing, and accommodated about 8 rowers. So it was a sailing and rowing vessel. In 2011, we took our East Carolina students there as part of a field school, and we teach them how to record small vessels and gathered even more data on this boat. And later on, a thesis topic by one of our master's students. This particular manuscript digs into the Manigault family history in depth, but also created 3D models of these very iconic boats as a way to preserve them for the future. Another example is a boat also used on the Santee River called the Accommodation. And it is in the holdings of one of the local plantations, Middleton Place. It is the same as the Bessie, but it was made out of 2 logs joined in the middle. And the curatorial paperwork notes very specifically that it was built by African-American boat builders and purchased by a Mr. Henson in 1855. So we have a date plus the ethnicity of the builders. So simpler forms of dugout canoes abound in other repositories. We had quite an interesting adventure finding them in people's attics, house decor in their living rooms, even a buffet bar in a seafood restaurant, and people's gardens and museums, and attempted to do an inventory of all these different types of vessels. So this is Chris Amer, the previous state archaeologist, and myself many years ago. So these are some contrasting examples. On the left, you can see a very simple form, appearing distorted because it takes on the shape of the tree trunk it was built out of. And then on the right, you can see a 20th century dugout canoe that was adapted for an engine, an outboard engine that we used right up until the mid-19th century. And the latter was built by a European American white family who were interviewed and suggested that this was a skill they had learned from Native Americans. And quite likely it could have been African-American boat builders as well. So these vernacular watercraft continue to be discovered and sometimes recovered on a regular basis. Inland waterways as well, such as this canoe from the Chattooga River. Or another on the beach on Tefusky Island in South Carolina. And this is a picture of the vessel in situ. So current research moving forward includes databases of canoe-built boats, both in the southeastern USA and Caribbean. Our students are continuing to do theses on Native American and African boat cultures. We're looking for historical imagery and description of boats, ethnographic studies of contemporary boat cultures, as well as detailed photographic and archaeological documentation of hull remains in museums, in situ underwater, on riverbanks and marshes. And we're also beginning to teach courses at East Carolina University in Native American maritime history, as well as African and Caribbean maritime history and archaeology. So really trying to expose the students to a more diverse maritime legacy. This is another project you can see in the slides where our ECU students worked on a project with Parris Island Military Museum in South Carolina. This is a Native American canoe that had been recovered many years ago and distributed to various conservation facilities. When we embarked on this project, it was in at least 50 pieces. It was very challenging to fit them together like a big jigsaw puzzle. But we finally, working with the Marines, figured out a way how to do this, and it's currently on display in the museum. So these are the sort of projects that we're hoping to do more of. Okay, moving on from the historical research from the archaeological research to the historical record, in an attempt to trace some of the African maritime legacies to help us interpret the archaeological record. A very rich source is imagery. Most historical depictions of colonial era African ports show a variety of dugout canoes. Go back there. Carrying passengers and goods to ships. And in addition, they show these stylistic details of the boat form, as well as propulsion methods such as paddling the boats. Okay, this one is especially interesting. It's titled The Pirogues of the Africans. And it shows 3 different style boats. You can see the canoes pulled up on the beaches, a very simple form. Another one, which is rope or paddled with these 2 bow and stern features, which were used to hoist onto people's shoulders and launch into the surf. And then a third one with sails also being paddled. Their descriptions, along with these types of drawings, about 3-month-long sailing voyages along the coast of Africa from Northwest Africa, so from Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegambia to Angola. They describe how rivers connected these inland communities to the sea people who navigated up and down the coastline in these brilliantly colored boats with crescent moons, stars, and sea-like symbols. The coastal voyages used to utilize sails as well as masts and paddles. The sails were made out of rush mats sewn together and woven into a canvas. Boats were painted both inside and outside and adorned with what they called fetishes and idols, such as dried corn, heads of lions, goats, and monkeys, and other animals. And if the voyage was long, they would often hang a dead animal like a goat off the stern. So this is a 19th century example of a boat in Congo with a deer horn adorning it. So you could sort of get an idea from the ethnographic record. African boatmen were observed by travelers as experts in navigating the rough surf along the coastline of Africa as early as 1500, either using their body weight and a paddle to dexterously maneuver the boat in these giant canoes, or take them through the surf, as you can see on the left, the image on the left side. By 1650, the literature shows that they had lists of what they called canoemen serving Dutch and English trade ships in the region of like 350, for example, in Elmina and Guinea. And by 1790, they totaled around 1,000. So these canoeists were part of a workforce that was really an integral part of the operating procedures of the transatlantic trade. And they received wages as employees, they ferried passengers and cargoes to and from the beaches, and were often implicated along with the colonists in illegal trade. So in the West Indies, these enslaved Africans also served as port labor service, especially in the sugar and rum industry. And you can see these little really excellent depictions of the boats and the boat forms. And here's rolling either rum or sugar onto a boat, but in this painting, you can see the form of the boat and the stylistic traits. Even more interesting in regard to the gigantic naval warfare canoes on the river systems of Congo and Nigeria, a variety of large war canoe illustrations show banks of warriors launching assegais, African spears, above the paddlers. But descriptions also note European accessories like umbrellas as awnings, and then mounting cannons on the bows and the stern. In addition to boating, the explorers and newspapers detail fishing and hunting methods of large aquatic animals like hippos and reptiles like crocodiles. Other resources include detailed labeled drawings of boats and paddle designs, historic boat models, and archaeological finds like the Dafuna canoe in Nigeria, which dates to 8,000 years ago. If you look at this canoe image, there's one that looks remarkably like the Bessie in the accommodation in the Charleston Museum. It has a rudder. You also see another one that looks more like the Senegambia versions, and then a series of different stylistic paddles and small accessories like a scoop for bailing water and a calabash for storing food. Travelers kept detailed descriptions of the canoe building process and function of the design features. So we know how they actually went about scooping out these giant canoes. Early ethnographers like Mary Kingsley was intrigued by the sails, and she described how they were made from grass mats woven together, and then rigging made out of these so-called bush ropes. Contemporary studies like that of Jojada Verrips, he's from the anthropology department at the University of Amsterdam, analyzes the decoration of the boats and also goes into the gender ascriptions that they gave both to the trees and to the boats, giving them anthropomorphic qualities. And he argues that boat decoration and construction gives us insights into the social consciousness of a community. So if you see a collection of boats on the beach in Africa, and presumably in our southern colonies, this represents to the researcher a mindscape that can be interpreted. So moving from Africa and trying to connect the southeastern seaboard, it's evident from photographs of the late 19th century boats that plantation boats began to vary in design. They were no longer paddled, but rowed in the European style. And what is interesting about this particular photograph is it appears that there is a woman, looks like an African-American woman, who is at the tiller and is steering the boat. Early explorers in the Southeast, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida, similarly to the African explorers, colonial explorers, also reveal that these plantation vessels were manufactured with the canoe form. And this was an essential element, both with Native Americans and with African Americans. Plantations were situated on rivers and typically had a fleet of boats, but the iconic workboat was the periago. Newspapers also reveal that seagoing skills and boating experience were very much valued for laborers, both free and enslaved. And notices about stolen boats include details about wood type, construction, and ownership markings. Accessories and hardware, like chains and staples. while some of the legal acts provide a window into the punishment for enslaved Africans who stole these boats. So 9 lashes for the first offense, loss of an ear for repetition. Early photographs also complement these descriptions and our interpretation of the archaeological record. They depict a variety of boat forms like this flat. This is a large rectangular raft propelled by a loose-footed forward sail, and then these enormous sweeps. One other feature that we noticed in the archaeological record is that they also used canoe forms or log forms to construct these vessels. So the extremities, the bow and the stern, if you could call it that, on a raft, were actually made from a log which had been hollowed out and fastened. And likewise, if they had a long log, this would form the chine or the turn of the bilge on the raft, on the barge. And it's evident that they also used these flat boat forms in Africa, especially the Congo and the Niger Delta. So you can see here's a South Carolina rice barge, and then to the left, you can see these large raft, well, a small raft and a larger raft used in the Congo in the 1800s. Likewise, flatboats were used in the West Indies. Here's a small shoebox-sized raft, and then a much larger one used, I think this is some of the Dutch West Indies islands. Others are reminiscent of the museum exhibits, the Betsy and the accommodation. So it had what you could call an elegantly shaped hull, the typical wine glass stern with a rudder, and most likely built out of a single log, a large single log, or 2 logs joined together along the center line. And here you can see the removable mast that was mounted in the seats of the vessel. There are also descriptions of swimming and diving activities, including enslaved Africans teaching the plantation owners' children to swim, but also epic battles with marine life like alligators, sharks, and stingrays. In addition to use on plantations, these giant periagas, 40 feet in length, were also the colony's scout boats or pilot boats. And these served in the capacity as the first colonial navy along the coast, as well as up the river mouths. These were arteries leading to inland plantations and settlements. So in essence, it was not only a Creole boat material culture, but also a shared experience in that they defined the maritime landscape of the colonial and the antebellum world. So according to the legislative records in 1719, they had a draft system that required crews of Negroes, mulattoes, mustees, and enslaved Indians to crew these naval vessels. And I think this really represented not only the boat type, but also the people in this colonial world who were serving aboard these vessels together. And that is all I have for you today. I just want to acknowledge all the agencies and institutions who've supported this research, including the Maritime Archaeology Division at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, starting way back in the 90s. The Charleston Museum and other locales like Middleton Place, who very freely offered up their museum exhibits for our students to clamber all over. And then, of course, the program in maritime studies and all the graduate students and faculty who've supported this. So thank you very much. Just want to end showing you some Senegal fishing pirogues. Had the opportunity to visit it in 2018 for a UNESCO conference, and when I saw these boats abounding on the beaches, it really made me think of these African watercraft that sailed so many months along the coastline of Africa. So thank you, and I'll take any questions at this point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, you can either put it in the chat function or in the Q&A and we'll get to them. I have a few comments already. So we have from Marty Klein. Hi, Lynn. Greetings from cold Boston and everything. We also have Dr. Lynn Harris. Nice job.
Yeah.
Everything. So while we wait for some questions to come in, I have a question. So while you're doing this research or your students are doing this research, have you guys been working with any of the, descendant communities like the Gullah communities and stuff, or the specific descendant communities with any of the plantations that you've sort of been researching with? What have you been doing in that way?
Yeah, we have a student right now who's working with some of the Native American tribal groups on a dugout canoe that's come out, and they're doing public events, and it's very much part of their culture, and they're involved in the research. So that has been, it is on the radar for future in terms of the African American groups. We, in terms of the diving, we're looking forward to working with Society of Black Archaeologists.
With Justin and everyone, yeah.
Right.
Okay, so excellent. We have so another question is, when you're looking at the comparison between African watercrafts and the watercrafts that you're finding in the Low Country, are you finding any sort of parts of the watercraft that might stand out as sort of intentional, sort of slowing the watercraft down as a way to sort of, disrupt work by the enslaved population or anything like that?
In terms of construction features?
Yeah, anything. I think what it means is anything that sort of would make the boat not as efficient intentionally, as a way to, again, sort of disrupt the labor.
Not to my knowledge. Plantations had boat races. That was one of the, I guess, cultural activities that were highlighted, and there was somewhat of a pride in being, from the plantation owner's point of view, of having the fastest boats and the strongest rowers. I think more in the sense that these boats were utilized by patroons who are very knowledgeable about the landscape, possibly in collusion early on with Native Americans who were also enslaved. And it served their purposes to escape with these boats. They had fairly easy access to them. Of course, if they were caught, they were, duly punished, as we saw with, 39 lashes, loss of an ear. But so I haven't found any, and I'm thinking that the question came from laborers who would throw away a tool or disrupt the labor process. Whereas with boats, it might be more that this was a tool for them to escape, for them to gain independence.
Then you do want it to be as fast as it can.
You want it to be as fast as possible. But that's a very interesting question, and certainly one to consider in future. Okay.
But sort of going along with that about using them to escape, how frequently, do we have any sort of idea of how frequently they were used for escape, or that maybe the patroons themselves, even if they weren't escaping, were using them to help others, sort of?
Yeah, the newspapers are an excellent source of information, and typically they'll list, setting out a reward system for plantation, particular person will describe the the slave, what they looked like, what boat they'd taken, and then some sort of reward. So the prevalence of those notices certainly indicate that taking boats as an escape route and as a mechanism was popularly used. And of course, it was the fastest way to leave a plantation rather than on foot, often where you would likely encounter, patrols trying to, find escaped communities. So I would say, looking at newspapers and punishes meted out and requests for lost boats to be found is a good indicator.
Okay. We have another question. Since there may be overlap and similarities between indigenous American canoes and enslaved African canoes, are there any identifying factors to distinguish between the two, or does it mostly depend on context of artifacts, locations found within the vessel?
Yes, I would say it's that was one of the challenges, because a canoe form is often difficult to say that, this is an African canoe form or Native American, but it does very much depend on the context, the artifacts, plus the provenience, whether it was near a plantation, and where we were working were some of the biggest plantations with the largest communities of enslaved individuals. And whereas the Native American canoes were not, as far as we can tell from the historical records, these huge built up canoes, that's more with the African tradition to have the larger canoes paddled with multiple rowers, unless you're on the Mississippi, where you do have these large canoes. But in the context of South Carolina, they're generally the smaller, more simpler design canoes are attributed towards Native Americans.
Okay. So I think one of our last questions is, have any of these canoes been found more inland, like in eastern South Carolina, eastern North Carolina, sort of more inland along just the rivers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And they go up as far as the fall line, so all the rivers where the little waterfalls and the waterway tends to narrow out and get shallower. We found canoes, or at least the state inventory shows canoes or canoe locations in these areas. Now these seem to be very popular items, artifacts for local members of communities to haul out of the river. So often this is a sort of a proactive, a reactive versus proactive management initiative, where you'll find somebody, a fisher person or a boater encountering these canoes up in the more inland areas. But for the state management purposes, it does include any site, any shipwreck or any small boat in a navigable waterway. So it is in the jurisdiction, the management domain of both South Carolina and Georgia.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. Those were the questions that we had. And so thank you, Dr. Harris, and thank you to our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which is on Wednesday, November 17th, when we are joined by Gabriela O. Menendez, who will be speaking about queer archaeology. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. So have a wonderful Wednesday, everyone, and have a great day.